Now, the next speaker I'd like to introduce, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Heewon Kang. Dr. Kang is a Research Assistant Professor at the Institute of Health and Environment at Seoul National University and a Visiting Research Fellow at the University of Queensland. And she's also an affiliate researcher with the Tobacco Endgame Centre of Research Excellence. Dr. Kang holds a Sejong Science Fellowship grant from the National Research Foundation of Korea, which is funded by the Korean government. Her research focuses on developing surveillance systems for tobacco control and endgame strategies and evaluating the potential impacts of new policies and products on ending the tobacco epidemic. Dr. Kang will be presenting on a vision for tobacco endgame in Korea and suggestions for countries with endgame aspirations.
Thank you, Coral, for the introduction. Before starting my presentation, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. Today, I'm going to talk about the vision for tobacco endgame in Korea, which is an example of a country with endgame aspirations. So I'm going to start off with a little bit about why suggestions are required for countries that have no endgame goals. Then I'm going to walk you through a little bit about the landscape for tobacco control in Korea. And based on the comparison between the leader countries in tobacco control and in Korea, I'm going to provide some suggestions for the fellow countries that have not yet set endgame goals. So as most of the people here in this symposium would know, there are quite a lot of countries who has already set endgame goals. There are some differences in the goals and the timeframes, but these countries are generally characterized with a clear goal of minimizing smoking prevalence to near zero levels within 2 decades. And also these countries have low smoking prevalence at about 15%. So the countries with endgame goals include Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Sweden. But if you look at the smoking prevalence worldwide, you can see that unlike the countries that have already adopted endgame goals, so many other regions still have high smoking prevalence. So the global adult smoking prevalence as of 2020 is 33% for men and about 7% for women, with some regions way exceeding the global average. And similarly, the countries with tobacco endgame goals are in the last phase of the tobacco epidemic, which means that smoking prevalence in these countries has been reduced for more than 10% and is currently fairly low. But again, other countries that have not set endgame goals are in the earlier stages of the tobacco epidemic. So does this mean that these countries in the earlier stages of the tobacco epidemic should not think about pursuing endgame and concentrate on pursuing conventional measures? To answer this question, we went back to one of the papers on the definition of the tobacco endgame published in 2012 by Thompson, which states that tobacco endgame is both the goal of ending the tobacco epidemic, but also the process of planning and implementing endgame strategies. So planning for endgame includes deciding on whether a country should pursue endgame now or not, and if yes, what would be the prerequisites and the implementation strategies. Most of the suggestions for endgames have come from the countries that are fairly advanced in tobacco control and have already set endgame goals, which may be a little bit ahead of the countries with no endgame goals. So here we chose Korea as a country who has not yet adopted endgame goals but aspires to do so. The reason for choosing Korea as an example is that although the smoking prevalence is a bit high at the moment, it is at the lowest since records. So Our most recent statistics in 2021 says that the smoking prevalence for adults is approaching 15%, which is also a favorable circumstance for adopting tobacco endgame policies. And also, there is a consistent political will to eliminate tobacco-related harms. So there is a consensus among the public and the policymakers that tobacco control is important and effective if implemented in the right way. So I'm going to walk you through about the landscape for tobacco control in Korea now. Being the country with one of the highest smoking prevalence among the high-income countries, Korea is often considered as a test bed for novel tobacco products. And my Google search told me that South Korea is 78 times smaller than Australia, but has twice as many people. This means that if a new flagship store selling tobacco products opens in the capital region, more than half of the whole population would reach the store within just 1 hour. So below are the pictures taken when heated products were introduced. Korea was one of the very first countries to have heated products. And you can see on the right that even in 2022, people will still queue when a new brand is launched. Cigarettes, heated products, and e-cigarettes are the most common forms of tobacco or nicotine products found in Korea. And because of our definition of tobacco in our Tobacco Business Act, same regulations are applied to cigarettes, HTPs, and ends, which means that taxes, smoke-free areas, cessation support, and warning labels are applied all to these products. Just like most parts of the world, combustible cigarettes are the most commonly used product, followed by heated tobacco products and ends. We are also aware of substantial dual and triple users, as non-cigarette product users use at least one product, the majority of them. And also for the youth prevalence, we note that cigarette prevalence is fairly lower compared to adults, but not so low in terms of HTPs and ends. We also have a domestic tobacco industry called the KTNG. This corporation was government-owned until 2001, until it was fully privatized in 2002. But still, it owns the largest market share for all the products sold in Korea compared to Philip Morris and BAT. KTNG donates lots of money to the government and some of the universities, and is involved in aggressive domestic and international CSR activities. So now I'm going to talk about the attempts regarding tobacco endgame in Korea. So the first one was the proposal to ban the manufacture and sales of cigarettes in 2005, which I think that has some common aspects to the endgame thinking today. It was led by the director of the National Cancer Center, and he proposed to reduce smoking prevalence by continuously increasing taxes. Then once the prevalence is low enough, to ban the manufacture and sales of cigarettes. This attempt led to a submission of a petition to the National Assembly in 2006. And again, the goal was to phase out manufacture and sales of cigarettes over the next 10 years. And the people involved in the submission were 158 individuals, including the dignitaries such as the director of the National Cancer Center, the former president of Korea, and the former speaker of the National Assembly. Public attitude toward this legislation was also measured, and the results showed that about 70% showed support for this legislation. Obviously, this attempt was not successful, as we still have cigarettes manufactured and sold in Korea. The first mention of Endgame by the government was in May 2019. So at this time, the government announced a new national tobacco control plan, and lots of news articles covered that the government has finally called for a tobacco endgame. But if you really look at the contents of the plan, there were no endgame goals or a target date. And the measures included in the plan were really incremental conventional measures. For example, increasing the size of warning labels and expanding the smoke-free areas. Now I'm going to show you what we did here. So we compared the experiences of Korea with the leading countries for tobacco control, which is Australia, Finland, and New Zealand. These are, of course, only parts of the leading countries in tobacco control. So we compared the landscapes for tobacco endgame goals, and endgame policy implementations, along with MPOWER implementations. So the leading countries were characterized with daily tobacco smoking prevalence below 15%. And what we found was that tobacco control in these countries were pursued either based on a comprehensive act or issue-specific acts. We also identified that there were research centers for tobacco control or endgame. So, for example, Aspire in New Zealand and Tobacco Endgame CRE in Australia are primarily consisted of university academics, whereas the Finnish Institute of Health and Welfare is a state-owned research institute. The goals in these countries were a little different in nature, as Australia and New Zealand was going to minimize smoking to the minimum levels, whereas Finland aimed to reduce nicotine use. But generally, these countries had a goal of reducing the prevalence to less than 5% within a target date. New Zealand was the only country implementing a mixture of innovative endgame measures with conventional approaches, whereas Australia and Finland was implementing incremental conventional approaches. We found that some of the goals in the Australian National Tobacco Strategy were consistent with endgame policies, such as limiting nicotine in cigarettes, but there were no specific measures or timeline. And it was also important to note that the endgame plans in the leading countries all addressed the Article 5.3 of the FCTC to reduce industry influence. So, for example, in Australia, the National Tobacco Strategy covered the Article 5.3 in its Priority Area 1 to protect public health policy from the commercial vested interests of the tobacco industries. We also analyzed endgame policies among these countries using the policy categories suggested by McDaniel in 2016. And again, we found that New Zealand was the most prominent country implementing bold endgame policies. So as Richard introduced in the morning, they were going to implement denicotinization, banning sales by birth year, and reducing retailers substantially. And for the MPOWER implementations, we found that no country has achieved the highest level of all MPOWER measures, but New Zealand, which was the only country to implement bold endgame policies, was also the country with the strongest MPOWER implementations. We found that compared to the leading countries, Korea had weak protect and enforce measures, and this is also true for lots of the countries outside Korea who has not yet set endgame goals. So in summary, endgame attempts related to the tobacco endgame have been extremely limited in Korea. There were no goals, but it was important to note that the past attempts included legislative process and assessment of public support. And we also note that not all MPOWER measures must be implemented at the highest level to pursue endgame, but strong MPOWER measures sets the stage for the endgame. Below is a little summary table providing how the leading countries were different from Korea. So the leading countries had relatively low smoking prevalence, research centers, legislation for tobacco control. They had stronger MPOWER implementations, and also had tobacco endgame goal within a time frame, and their endgame plans covered measures to reduce the industry influence, whereas Korea did not have these features. So these are the suggestions for the countries, for the fellow countries with endgame aspirations. The first is to describe the landscape and previous efforts related to the tobacco endgame. This would provide insights on where the goal is and how to get there, and also to strengthen MPOWER measures that are not fully implemented, and to establish and implement measures to reduce industry influence. Most importantly, setting tobacco endgame goals within a specified time frame is required. Simulation models can be employed, but importantly, these goals should be discussed and should be agreed on. We also found that establishing legislation for tobacco control or endgame is important. Depending on the national context, it can be pursued on a single comprehensive law or patchwork of laws, but I think the single comprehensive law would be more effective as it avoids some conflicts with the other laws. And also, just like the Finland example, stating the goal to end the tobacco epidemic in the law is a good idea. And research centers to create, synthesize, and disseminate research findings on endgame policies is also a key to pursue endgame. Because tobacco control is very different depending on the national context, I think that a national research center should be established, but also international cooperations are required so these centers can discuss and share the findings. This is the last slide of my presentation. It is to acknowledge my co-authors. This paper was a manifesto for us to declare that we will be committing to adopt endgame policies in Korea. So lots of the people who are in the field of tobacco control in Korea were involved in this work. I would be happy to answer any questions, and thank you.
Do we have any questions from the room? No? Well, I've got a question. So I had it in my head and now it's just popped out of my head now that I've just... have you gone back and looked at that example of the attempt to phase out tobacco sales and manufacture? And has anyone done that up as like a case study and looked at where it had some success potentially in terms of galvanising support or where it didn't?
There is a book published that is on the attempt, which is in Korean. But in brief, it was on why it failed. So the book reported that because the smoking prevalence at that time was over 60% for men, it was too radical in the national context. So the bill was just sitting in the National Assembly until our 17th National Assembly was dissoluted and the bill was abolished. Also, another barrier to the attempt was because our market size is too big. So Richard told us that New Zealand has 6,000 retailers. We have 160,000 retailers, and including some farmers, growing tobacco. So that's another barrier.
Yeah, so there's quite a few different angles there to target, both the supply but also the manufacture in Korea.
Yes.
So, yeah. Did we have any other questions? Yes, down here.
Oh, thank you for a really nice presentation. I just wanted to pick up on the final comment that you made about the number of retailers and the overall population density. What would you see as being the most important of the different endgame strategies that you should be thinking about in Korea? Is there a place that you see as being your starting point?
We are also trying to go for reducing retailers at the moment because there are just too much of them. But the biggest barrier is because of most of the tobacco products are sold in convenience stores in Korea, and their profits, the share for the profits for tobacco products in the convenience stores are about 40%. So we're really trying to provide an alternative profit source for those people. And another step is to start licensing. We have a negative licensing scheme at the moment, so we have a list of the tobacco retailers, but we don't know what products they're selling at the moment and whether if they're complying to the rules of the law. So that's another barrier for us at the moment.
Thanks very much, Heewon. I was just going to suggest one other factor that's quite influential in endgames and whether they're adopted, and that's sort of the political factor. So I think all the things you mentioned, I think they're absolutely right. But when I look at some of the really major advances, like, say, plain packs in Australia with Nicola Roxon, and then the smoke-free bars with Michael Martin in Ireland, and in the New Zealand context, I do think our health minister has been a big difference. We've been going on about this stuff for years, but it's not been happening at government level, and suddenly we've got a change of health minister, and it's all on. So I think sort of people in political analysis don't like to talk too much about individuals and that, but actually I think it is important, and there's some degree of luck in that. But I guess the other thing is whether we should be trying to identify and nurture such people to try and increase the chance that we have a really good political champion in a position of authority and influence, like we've been lucky enough, I think, in New Zealand. And I wonder if there's anyone like that in Korea that might be on the horizon who might take this forward.
Yes, I agree with you completely about the need of a political champion. But a problem now in Korea is that the issues for tobacco control has actually turned into a political issue. So a couple of years ago, when we were trying to raise taxes, the parties were using it like against each other, that it's really like for the government to gather more taxes and stuff. But we are also looking for a political champion right now, but just there's no one on the horizon at the moment.
Right. And I guess that's the Aspire model was to actually start building all of that before there was the political champion, wasn't it? So you don't have to wait for the political champion to be there to get the things in place to pave the way for that.
Yeah, you need both.
Yeah.
But that's what, for one analysis is that's what's really moved things forward.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much for that presentation, Heewon. That was excellent.